Hello, everyone. We're going to be talking about some scholars and what they think about the gods in the Odyssey in this video. So, we're going to start off with a couple of scholars looking at kind of how the gods interact with justice as a theme in the Odyssey. So, we've got Jasper Griffin to start off with, and Griffin says that the Olympian gods may not look like the embodiment of pure virtue, but it is important to the Odyssey that they do respond to the inextinguishable cry of the human heart for justice. What does Griffin mean by this then? And it's basically a sort of argument saying that the gods are important for bringing about the justice in the story. Griffin makes this differentiation between the way that we see the gods act and the way that they actually sort of judge the mortals. The gods do not act in a virtuous way. Now, we don't necessarily see this a lot in the Odyssey. There are probably more examples in the Iliad of the gods acting in ways which are not necessarily ones that would be considered moral in society. But this is the way that Homer overall represents them. It's absolutely fine, for example, in the story that we hear in Book 8 for a god to commit adultery. And the worst that happens really is that Hephaestus ridicules them, but there isn't really any serious consequences to what we see Aphrodite and Ares doing. However, they very much are still going to be important for punishing mortals. And there's numerous examples that we could talk about in the Odyssey, but the best one is going to be what happens to the suitors. The gods respond to this. Zeus gives this omen that we see that it is the thing that Odysseus should be doing. So in Book 21, Zeus sending down that thunderclap, and therefore he suggests that these suitors must die for their crimes. And so this is really where Griffin is going to be so useful for arguing that the gods are responsible and do respond to this need for justice in the poem. If we have a look, though, at Moses Finley, and Finley is a scholar who I think classicists love to argue about, would be how I'd say it. Finley argues something slightly different to this. The ethics of the worlds of the Odyssey were man-made and man-sanctioned. Man could not turn to the gods for moral guidance. That was not within their power. There was no reverential fear of the gods. What is Finley arguing here? And I think I'll just preface this by saying that I tend to disagree with Finley, so take that as you will. Finley proposes really that within the story, the gods aren't responsible for enforcing morals or ethical decisions in the plot. And that's quite different from the argument that we just looked at before, which says that they very much are. So Finley looks at the way that the gods behave and then looks at the ethics and says that the gods don't behave in an ethical way. And so the ethics are not ones which the gods are necessarily involving. Instead, Finley would argue that Odysseus arriving and killing the suitors, that is man-sanctioned and man-made justice. That is him enforcing the ethics. It's not the gods getting involved, it's the mortals. And because the mortals don't look to the gods for the guidance on morals, the gods aren't necessarily something that they worry about. This bit then, there was no referential fear of the gods. Now, Finley argues that heroes don't fear the gods. He would look at somebody like Odysseus and also characters in the Iliad, and he would say, well, in the Iliad, they fight the gods, let alone fear them. But in the Odyssey, Odysseus isn't necessarily that afraid of the gods. His actions aren't usually ones of fear. And in fact, he would usually expect to at least have the support of the gods, but to be able to survive, for example, a storm by Poseidon. And Odysseus sort of goes into that. That's how Finley views it. Ordinary humans, on the other hand, well, they do have reason to fear the gods, not because the gods are going to bring about justice, but just because the gods may, being capricious, decide to punish you. That's how Finley views it. But he doesn't view mortals as God-fearing, i.e. they're not pious. So Finley would look at the suitors and he would say, well, the reason that they're so free in breaking their xenia and being bad guests and taking advantage of Odysseus being absent, well, that clearly demonstrates that they aren't pious, that they don't fear the gods, that there isn't this structure around which sort of leads them to do that. You very much can challenge this, of course. This could be an example of the hubris of the suitors in thinking that they can get away with it, and also the servants. And then the gods Zeus ensures that their hubris does not go unpunished. And to a lesser extent, Odysseus also is hubristic with the Cyclops and then is punished by the gods. So Finley's an interesting one. I would say quite easy to challenge, but definitely a perspective which you might want to pursue in your reading as well. Now let's have a look at some gods and what the scholars think about them in terms of how the gods impact the plot. So Emily Kearns argues, if we were to reduce the storylines of the Iliad and the Odyssey to the bare essentials, the gods would not have to feature at all. Without the gods, the epics would be quite different, however. Kearns therefore takes the plot and kind of separates it from the sort of feeling of the story and maybe some of the themes of the story. So she very much views it as a case of the core plot, the main features, and that's what Kearns is really talking about, the essentials, don't need the gods. So if we look at the essentials of the Odyssey, Odysseus on a mission to return home and to reclaim that home. We don't need to mention the gods in that. There's nothing necessarily essential about the gods within that plot, Kearns would argue. However, she does think that the gods are important still. They are just going to be more of a kind of causational sort of feature. They change the way that a character maybe does something, or they will be aligned with the morals of the story. And so the way that the morals are enforced is down to the way that the gods are interacting with that. And she also agrees with this view that the gods are aligned with the morals of the story. And so therefore what Odysseus does is supported by Zeus. So there's this sort of duality to what Kearns is arguing. You could remove the gods and the plot, the key points would be unchanged, but the feeling of the story would be very different. You wouldn't get the same kind of story, even if you got the same key plot points. Let's contrast that then with what Martin Thorpe thinks. And Thorpe is more along the lines of the gods are very much central to the plot, very much a part of the story. So it is Zeus who controls the course of events in both poems. And if Odysseus is the hero, Athene is almost the heroine of the poem. Thorpe really then sees the gods as being quite central, quite necessary to the plot. You can't move them. They are core to everything that happens. Without Zeus's permission, there is no return. Odysseus can't return home. Without Athene, there is no story, essentially, would be how Thorpe views it. And he actually goes on to argue that there's almost nothing that is so small that Athene won't involve herself in. There's nothing so insignificant that she wouldn't consider helping Odysseus if she feels it necessary. And so really he sees it as a case of the story would be completely different, the plot would be completely different if the gods were not included. So there we go, 4 different scholarly opinions, going through some of the views of the gods. And hopefully that helps you looking at some of the scholarly arguments involving those characters.